Anthony. I'll be today's presenter. Today we'll be talking about modernizing your architecture and your tech stack. And we'll talk about building a framework for application assessment, how to think about the different parts of your tech stack, and best practices that I've seen from my customers that I've worked with very closely, and talking about next steps. And we'll leave time kind of for a Q&A session to talk modernization. So I'll start off with a brief background about myself. I've been at Retool for about 3.5 years. I was a founding member of the go-to-market team. I've helped onboard personally hundreds of customers onto Retool's platform. Today I work with mainly large companies who are enabled by software. So these might not be traditionally tech businesses, but they span sort of all different shapes and sizes. Also different parts of their organizations have thought about Retool in different ways. So I'm excited to kind of share what their journeys have looked like. I've also had the chance to work on Retool Portals and Retool Embed, two products that take Retool beyond focusing just on internal web applications. So these two products allow our customers to build products for their customers, leveraging a white labeled Retool platform. And finally, the core features that I work on help our customers scale with us. So these are all things related to permissions, identity, user management, things that our kind of large companies, IT teams, centralized shared services teams really care about. So let's dive in. Why are we here? Companies spend a lot of money on IT, and internal tools, internal kind of back office software, operation software is a big share of that. And it's difficult to consolidate because businesses are very complex, yet this is one of the biggest desires amongst developers. And so Retool over the last several years has conducted a state of internal tools survey. We'll definitely recommend and share out kind of what the results look like, but we pull developers and understand how they think about both the tools that they build, the tools that they use, how leaders think about internal tooling strategy. And we talk internal tools, and I want to kind of give context to what I mean by internal tools and internal software. So we'll talk about today what operation software is. So operation software is a category of tooling, mainly focused on internal or data tools around productivity. And we'll talk through how to actually assess your entire application stack for your operation software. I'll share customer best practices that I've seen over the years. And we'll also talk about how you might build a roadmap and think about all of your application tooling in terms of kind of actually driving customer outcomes. So a lot of this will be focusing on the frameworks, kind of the to-dos that you should be kind of making sure that you're kind of going along and walking through each part of your stack. And we'll just dive into that right now. So let's give kind of an overview of operation software. So operation software focuses on unique business processes. So this means that we're building tools for a dedicated group of users with very specific requirements. Often this tooling comes with the in-house data connections that you might have been maintaining by internal teams. This might be directly connecting to Snowflake or RDS or internal APIs. This is often not off-the-shelf software. The second point of this of operation software is that it's specifically focused on productivity. So you're not seeing kind of flashy animations, forms, tables, and charts. It's exclusively built to solve a problem. And forms, tables, and charts often are built around data. So they connect data from many different sources, often give you kind of restricted access based on who you are. And so for that reason, kind of permissioning, access controls are super, super important. And this is important to contextualize as kind of productivity and operation software versus, your customer-facing product. In a lot of cases, this might be things that you are actually investing a lot of effort into and resources into, and care a lot about, the animations, the analytics, the tracking, the instrumentation. And it's not to say that operation software isn't critical. It certainly is the backbone of the business, but it is important to focus on sort of the more productive angles around the software that you'd be leveraging. So Retool is a category of operations software, and we'll kind of talk about the different layers of the application stack and how that might relate. But this is sort of our bread and butter, and this is what we've been focusing on since our inception. I'm starting with internal tools and now focusing on external tools. So We've been thankful to work with a company called Equipment Share. They allow you to kind of rent equipment when you're on site and in construction. They have kind of a nice quote around thinking about maintaining and building these internal tools. So started off kind of with focusing on less technical folks, giving them access to data. And this all started out with an understanding of what their application stack looked like. And so they actually kind of went through a kind of a very intense assessment for their entire software stack and looked at where does Retool kind of fit in. So over the course of time, the idea is that we're able to provide more data, more controls to less technical users without sacrificing any kind of security or stability. So what are the challenges when operation software becomes legacy and outdated? Well, the first is that they become very expensive to maintain. This often means that having a lot of resourcing to upgrade the software, to add additional features, and that obviously if it's not changing that much, you're incurring a cost just simply by it running. The second is that legacy systems don't really play nicely with new integrations of processes. So if your business is evolving, you're building new software, either that's internally or externally, you're going to need to kind of think about your application stack holistically. And so if legacy systems don't tend to integrate with new things that you build, right? They might not be API first. They might not have the data connectors if you're using vendors. And so it's really important to kind of have a constant assessment of what your tools look like over time, and make sure that sort of the net new tool that you buy or use or build can integrate with your existing stack. This is not just kind of looking at one piece. You have to look at it holistically. And finally, if you're not able to build new tools quickly or maintain your tools in an efficient way, ultimately you slow the business down, right? The stakeholders of operation software are less technical users, end users that might not know how to write SQL, that might not know kind of thinking about APIs or data schemas. So when you're building kind of this operation software and it's going outdated, if folks call in support and they ask you to run scripts and you're the only one who can do it, the outcome is quite poor, right? You're the bottleneck, or there'll be different bottlenecks kind of by technical users across the entire system. And so you're not able to respond to customer requests fast enough. You're not able to build new features to address problems and drive the business forward. So for that reason, modernizing the entire stack allows you to just be more efficient, allows you to reduce the operational costs of running software. It also lets you to think about other problems in your business that might be more important, customer facing, and revenue driving. So when you look at kind of the full stack as an effort here, you'll be investing in durable solutions across every layer. The second is each additional feature that you will be building will hopefully be easier and faster than the last, right? If you build the right processes in place, the right governance model, if you define kind of these processes early on in your journey, it'll be a lot better as you and your business scale. So this makes you more resilient to change over time. And finally, you're able to iterate very quickly, given that you have the processes in place, the tooling, and we'll talk about kind of what that roadmap looks like to actually look at your stack holistically. And I'll share sort of the customer experiences that I've had over the course of my time at Retool. So the way that we've seen applications break down, across all of our customers is there's kind of this notion of a line. So there's applications and processes that are above the line that are business critical, and there's applications that are below the line. So above the line are those high value tools that you actually want to invest in, that you want to kind of bring in more resources, really think about thoughtfully, and really make sure that you're building the right thing. But if this becomes outdated for any reason, this will also carry the biggest risk for the business, right? Changing might be very hard. Adding additional features will be hard. So of course, this is important to kind of address earlier on, sort of what the core applications and use cases are for your business, and what that long tail might look like. Below the line, you might actually see a bunch of tools, a huge sprawl of tools and applications that individually might not bring that much value because maybe they're focused on a very specific team or a use case, and they might also be in the backlog, right? Things that you've never kind of gotten to because it didn't line up with a broader sort of business objective. But over the course of time, if you have this massive long tail of one-off scripts and written in Postman or database commands that you've sort of stored on your local computer and you're just sharing with engineers, that amasses quite significant business risk as well, and prevents you from being nimble. So we've kind of seen both cases. We've seen Retool replace these sort of high value above the line use cases where people are considering, hey, do we rebuild, our franchisee management portal from scratch, using React and maybe a outsourced development team, or do we use something like Retool? And that, sometimes we'll start out talking about what those high value use cases look like and the risk. In other cases, you might just look at Retool and you say, great, this helps me build a quick UI. This helps clear my backlog of ad hoc requests so that I can just build an app, hand it to a stakeholder and get on with my day. And over time, obviously, you might start thinking about Retool as a platform as you have more of these use cases. Whereas again, if you're starting above the line, you have to have kind of the checklist of features and the belief that this is something that can spread across your business versus, just that one use case. So when you have that tooling sprawl of these sort of one-off applications, or maybe just several different software tools, several dozens of software tools across your business, that could be very, very painful. The reasoning is because applications form the backbone of these operational processes. So this is true for both internal teams and for customers. And overall, this increased operational complexity hurts everyone. It specifically hurts your end users the most, but the way it kind of manifests is different across the stack. So specifically, a point that I kind of haven't mentioned yet is that if you have many tools talking to different sets of data that integrate with only a subset of your tooling stack, that data silo that gets created for the single use case really hurts as it grows. And so, if people are not able to get access to data across the organization, you're not able to make better decisions. And finally, if you have many different tools with different security protocols and different levels of security features, there's no way to enforce standards. And so again, this is all kind of going back to the reason for why you need to make a concerted effort to build this sort of application assessment process when you're modernizing your entire stack. Kind of technical fitness and technical capabilities are a core part of that, which we'll dive into in just a second. So kind of another example here around, Zappos, who's a Retool customer here. They really thought about Retool sort of just initially as a platform. And so we worked very closely with them to really check the boxes, make sure that this is something that could be centralized within a team and be distributed across many different development teams and end users for different use cases. So you want to make sure that, this platform or the software that you're building, if it's homegrown, can actually integrate with existing systems so that you're not just sort of adding in additional cruft and additional tech debt into your infrastructure. So you want to think about consolidation. You also maybe want to look at, what are the purposes of the tools that I'm building, right? Is it just data visualization? Am I actually enabling write back capabilities? What are the security implications of writing back to my data? And do I have kind of the right observability monitoring and auditability for my solutions? So let's talk about now kind of how we see application assessment criteria actually play out. And there's three ways to break it down. The first is business fit. So how well does your application software stack handle change ultimately? If new criteria come in, are you able to address it very quickly? Or do you have to kind of go back to the drawing board, maybe have to rebuild things in-house and take additional time? So we'll talk about sort of what that means when we actually break down business fit, but that's a key criteria. And often sort of these requirements for understanding a technical solution will always map back to the business objectives. The next is technical fit. So when you're running your systems, how stable is it? How secure? What's the uptime? We'll talk about metrics that you want to look at when you're assessing technical fit of any solution that's in your stack. And then of course, cost, right? So you have software that you might be building in-house. There's vendors that you might be using that maybe all have their own license fees, but overall, what's sort of the total cost of ownership of my software tooling? So let's break it down and talk about business fit. As I mentioned, the first is productivity. And that's thinking, how well does it improve the productivity of both the people who are using the tools, but maybe also the people who are developing the tools as well, since they could sort of be their own stakeholder. The next is change. So how easy is it to update the system? How easy is it to upgrade it? When a new business challenge comes in, how is it able to solve that problem? Is it through the ways that the product supports, or is it in ad hoc requests? And finally, there could be reasons for just buying a very purpose-built piece of software, building it for just one use case. That is completely fine. The point is that we need to call out kind of how complete a solution is and really believe that we're doing the best to solve a specific use case with that tool. We hate when people are sort of shoehorning retool for things that it isn't meant to really be doing. And similarly, what we've seen with homegrown applications when our customers have built, homegrown admin tools, it often does everything and doesn't do everything well. So it does make sense in certain cases to sort of say, I'm building this for one problem that I can really know that this piece of software is solving over the course of a long period of time, versus saying that I'm just in a sort of generalizable state for the rest of it, not solving any problem, but then also not being able to say, well, we have this admin panel that we keep around, and maybe it's not time to just sort of invest in bespoke applications that we'd be developing. So to assess this, you really want to assess how are people using the product. Think of yourself as an anthropologist, and you're asking kind of questions around what the user experience is. You're asking, why was this built in the past if it's been maintained over time? You're maybe cataloging the feature requests that folks have, both for the vendor or for your internal teams, and how quickly those have changed, how quickly those have been addressed. That might give you signal on kind of the fitness of the tools. And also error rates, right? Is it stable? If it's not stable, is that a bad thing, right? Are we talking about business critical systems, or are we talking about spreadsheets that might have too many rows in them, and so they don't load all the time, and so breaking it down would create additional tech debt, but it might not actually be make or break, right? In that kind of use case. So you want to assess those things that are sort of qualitative and quantitative, and identify where's the business going. If we have future requirements that come in, do we feel confident on a scale of 1 to 5 that the layer of the software stack can address that? And ultimately, the people that will be really important in defining this are the people who are the current stakeholders, right? So we want to just understand, will this tool align with the roadmap of what folks want out of the product, and sort of what their goals are? So really, this is almost customer interviews, right, for internal stakeholders. Or in some cases, right, if you're building customer-facing operations tooling, this could be quite literally thinking, well, if they have sort of a massive kind of roadmap or agenda that they're shooting towards, how well can we align what we're building with that as well on the business side? Does it make sense for us to kind of pursue those challenges while still sort of addressing the current state? So to talk about actual productivity and what it means to measure productivity, you want to talk about, well, what's the value in accomplishing a task, right? So how quickly are my support agents able to resolve a ticket with this piece of software? Is this the only tool that they're using to resolve a ticket, or are there others? And this will kind of touch on completeness. But what does this look like if we were to expand the scope of use for, from the support team to DevOps or to other teams within the organization? That's really important, and especially when you're kind of thinking about measuring costs and longevity, you really do have to look kind of outside of the core use case. Cool. When you talk about agility, you might look at actual feature development. You can say, kind of in the past, if there have been feature, how quickly were those able to be turned around by the internal team? How quickly were they able to be prioritized, right? Because again, the bottleneck happens when you have a challenge, when your end users aren't able to self-serve, and you're stuck sort of writing scripts, and maybe you'll never kind of get to that UI. So that really means the actual time it takes to make the change. But when you make that change, are people forced to relearn new models, right? If I were to upgrade my tooling, do I have to build things in ways that are going to cause my end users to relearn the software and update their flow? So this really is important when you kind of have end users who are using your product at scale, this is obviously something that you want to roll out and test. But thinking about retraining, thinking about onboarding, and thinking about iteration is really important when assessing kind of the business fit. And finally, when we think about completeness, we talk about when and how frequently are we manually iterating, right? So like I talked about before, it could make sense to sort of build a tool that is very bespoke and solves one specific problem. But as soon as people want more out of it, you need to assess, am I actually going to expand the scope of use? Versus saying, well, maybe this tool is only meant for this job and that tool is only meant for that job, and it's actually okay not to consolidate. You should have a very good reason for not wanting to do that. Because what we've seen at Retool, we had this with a customer called Plaid, is the swivel chair problem, where in order to solve something, you have to go through 5 different screens to get something done, and you're being inefficient. And again, this is obviously hard to do. It requires a lot of buy-in across the board within the organization to do this consolidation. But you want to think about each individual solution and understand how complete it is, understand where the overlap is, so that when you kind of go to look at your business objectives and want to consolidate your tools, you'll see sort of where the overlap is and where you can kind of get rid of applications or reduce the scope to kind of reduce the technical debt over time. Okay, let's talk about technical fit now. So the most important thing is that you're not stuck with people writing scripts and one-off database commands, that you don't have subject matter experts holding the keys for your support team to get something done. If this is the case, oftentimes you might not even have a technical solution, and so it's worth kind of highlighting that in the assessment. When you're maintaining your tools, you would want to see how many folks do we need actually on board to update that software or to maintain it if it's heavily kind of on the infrastructure side of things. So this actually could pose business risks if, again, kind of the tool becomes very legacy and you have to kind of upgrade it. You have to go through a bunch of different protocols because it's talking about massive version upgrades. So constantly keeping a level of maintenance here is extremely important. But again, there could be different levels at which you need to maintain certain tools. And finally, how well does it work with existing processes and your technical direction? So if you have kind of different business goals where you might be rewriting your front end from Angular to React, what kind of downstream dependencies do I have? Or if you even look lower down in the stack, if I'm migrating from, let's say, Snowflake to RDS, what else do I need to change? And obviously, if you kind of look at the infrastructure side, that might be quite a bit. But in other cases, it actually might be quite light. So you need to think about the dependencies on this piece of software to understand what costs are associated with changing it over time. So there's some quantitative assessments. How many folks maintain the software? How much time does it take to make changes? When you think about adding the end-to-end feature, how often does that take? And how often does that happen? The point is, again, we're trying to get back to the point of assessing the costs and the resourcing investment in making changes to the stack. And again, this is not maybe the entire stack, for be just a part of that, but you need to kind of have this set of criteria so that you really are able to look at these things objectively. And finally, what is the cost of integrating this system with existing tools? If you're building a new tool that's focusing on data, let's say, is the cost of adding this dependency worth it over time? Does this align with the business objectives that we're trying to provide for our end users? And over time, if I make a change in one part, will I need to update everything that depends on it, and vice versa? Are there very close ties and dependencies between this tool and sort of everything else in our stack? When we think about stability and technical fit, it's also important to understand uptime, the viability of vendors, and the support needed from external resources, as well as internal resources, and specifically on security, what kind of data is being sent through the system, what is being stored, what's the system of record, or is this just integrating to a bunch of different APIs and showing them in one place? And is it doing it so securely with kind of the right protocols that you've established within the organization? So understanding your stability means that you have the right observability and monitoring solutions in place so that you can measure uptime and error rates in your tools. So this would mean, integration with Datadog and being able to kind of build custom metrics and custom dashboards. So this is super table stakes for any kind of tool that you build, any kind of software that you might purchase. You want to understand that it has sort of the ability to exist and integrate with your existing data stack. And if their downtime, if your system is not stable, we should understand what that risk looks like, either to the business and also the cost, right? So if systems are down, and that actually means you can't support customers as quickly, not only does that degrade customer trust, in a lot of cases that could also lead to reduced outcomes for the business. And when you think about the holistic technical fit, you want to view it across all of the different vendors, all the different layers of the stack, from the application layer to infrastructure to data as well. So when you think about, buying software off the shelf or kind of building in-house, if you're using a vendor, you need to understand, does their roadmap actually align with yours and help achieve your business goals? Obviously, if you're building for internal use cases with internal teams that are dedicated to this, because you have this very clear level of communication, you're all kind of on the same ship. Often that alignment can come more naturally, but at scale that could break apart when you have different teams asking for different things for the same centralized platform. So that's where you might want to go up a level higher and understand what maps back to the business objectives. But you have to do this sort of holistically, not just sort of per each layer. And of course, we want to audit our security features for every system that we introduce to it. And we need to see how it integrates with existing governance processes that we've established in the company. So you sort of will be building your additional net new features. And every single time, since we're talking about operations software, every single time you're going to need to understand, will this introduce any additional risk? Or have I already put the processes in place to sort of have those guardrails? And of course, with every tool that talks to data, you need to have auditability such that you can look back, you can understand who logged in, who made changes to your data sources, what kind of API calls were made. And again, this all goes back to integrating with the APM solutions in place. So stability and security really do rely on data and the focus of getting as many metrics as possible, which again goes back to the other point where I mentioned that integrating across all of your systems is extremely important. So let's talk about cost fit and break down total cost of ownership. We look at costs. You could look at non-recurring and recurring costs. So recurring costs could be operations and support needed to keep running the tool, as well as corrective maintenance, right? So fixing bugs, doing upgrades, and other things like additional non-recurring costs as well. So thinking about license variants, maintenance across your different tools. So preventative maintenance might be looking at preemptively upgrading things, knowing that there might be future changes coming in across the other parts of the business. So these could be, both considered recurring use cases for upgrades, but obviously the cadence could also be quite different depending on how important the tool is for you. Future costs focus on what does it look like to actually upgrade the tool and what will be my level of investment over time, what will be the enhancements that I will need to make to the tool based on the objectives of the business. And finally, right before I'm going to kind of go live with the tool, how many other resources from across the organization would I need to bring in to actually make that happen, right? QA, design, demoing, getting the team enabled on the tool itself. And then of course, kind of over the course of time, again, you're kind of going back to that cycle of maintenance and recurring and non-recurring current year costs. So we'll be sharing kind of a template at the end of this presentation, how to think about all of the total cost of ownership and the technical fitness. And this is just a very breakdown of each segment. So just to recap what we just covered, ultimately the fitness of your software is contextualized by your business initiative. So wherever your business is going, you need to understand how that maps back to the required capabilities. That way you could really be rigorous around what problems are your tools solving, and if that actually kind of is something worth investing in today versus in 6 months from now, knowing that this is not necessarily a short process. It's hard to also have software where you have a perfect business fit, a perfect technical fit, and a perfect cost fit. So depending on the business objectives, it could be okay to skew towards, for example, reducing cost if the business is slowing down. Or it could be more important to actually have agility so that you can launch a product faster, which is going to drive more revenue. And that might come at the cost of other things. And that, again, should be sort of justified by that business objective. And finally, it's important to have this framework of rating your technical fitness, your business fitness, and your cost fitness. So if you were to establish this kind of earlier on, it's really clear when you bring in new tools or you sort of decide to invest in new tools that it makes sense. And that you have an objective view of both the past, things change over time. A lot of people kind of come and go within businesses. So if you have that framework sort of codified, it's easier to see how those decisions sort of pan out over time and whether or not you need to reevaluate kind of how you're assessing your tools. Okay, so let's talk about now what it means to actually build a tooling roadmap. And so in this diagram, you have both your internal use cases, sort of private behind virtual private cloud on private infrastructure, and you have public-facing use cases, but they might be talking to the same data layer. So if you look on the right, you might have these sort of cloud API providers that are talking to your internal systems, be serving applications or tools to external users. But there's a lot of shared things within this diagram. We'll talk about sort of when it makes sense to centralize versus kind of stick to each different bespoke set of tools. So first, it starts off with your users. What this means is that end users, whether they're internal or external, are your most important stakeholders. So their experience is often directly tied to those business initiatives. They could be driving those business initiatives, but they're certainly close to those business initiatives. And so when you think about bringing on a new use case onto your tools, you need to think about what does it look like to actually provision those users access. And most importantly, we kind of talk about best practices and building this roadmap. You want to have a process by which people get access to that tool. And oftentimes this means direct integration with an identity provider, such as Okta, where you define how users might get access. And you also have to verify that the existing software that you might have, the vendors, are able to integrate with your identity provider. So then you can kind of have that centralized governance layer. The next way to think about this is project level access. So when you have maybe additional teams, who are already in your tools, can you give them access to the right set of applications, maybe scripts, so that they can go and get up and running quickly? And can you ensure that one team is sort of only scoped to their usage of the tool versus another team? That's very important when you kind of think about scaling and onboarding new teams, is that you have a process that says, hey, we know that you're using these applications. We know what level of permissions you want, and we're going to provision that for you without this sort of back and forth. And finally, if you look a layer lower, you need to also have the right data access. So maybe if two users with different roles are viewing the same applications, how do I make sure A doesn't see user B's data? The easiest way, and the way that I've seen kind of our best customers do this, is by being API first when it comes to writing their data, writing and making updates through forms. Everything kind of is talking to APIs. Reason being is that it's much easier to sort of integrate with different systems through an API first approach. And of course, again, as I talk about making sure that data is only shown to specific users, part of that is also making database enforcements on kind of row level security and passing in information about that current user when you're kind of querying your databases directly. So going back to this diagram now, we'll be talking about kind of this source of truth and data question. So data often helps teams operate more quickly. If you're giving everyone access to it, that's amazing, but that is also not something that is really straightforward. So you need to have that governance model in place to understand who your different users are, what those use cases are, and how do I provision them access. But you also might want to have that layer of auditability. And of course, you have that with database if you've properly set up your infrastructure, but APIs also give you this as well. And oftentimes what we've seen with Retool is that we have this, belief that our customers should be writing to their data through APIs and maintaining kind of a centralized access layer via an API, but reading is okay kind of directly to those data sources. So to get to that point where your application layer kind of works in this way, you need to have the right infrastructure in place. And so you want to work with container orchestration systems, things like Kubernetes, Terraforming. Retool has been also really amazing by certain customers, and we're happy to kind of talk through those best practices as well. But when infrastructure is automated, when configuration is sort of done out of the box, it makes users and teams who are sort of more up the stack able to self-serve. And when you're kind of creating this data catalog at the lower levels, you're creating those processes around scaling. It makes it easier sort of for the rest of the organization to not depend on you. So you're kind of reducing bottlenecks along the way. Now I want to talk about Coinbase and how they think about this. If you look at the kind of the diagram to the right here, the web application makes a call to Coinbase auth. So that's when kind of the user signs in. They're able to get information from Coinbase around what their roles are, where they map to, and sort of what they access. But then every time they query data, they pass that same information to a centralized API layer. And that API layer is basically something that says, I'm going to decode information about this current user making the query. I'm going to decide what data to show them. And I'm going to query that data and obviously return it back to the web application layer. So you have this really nice kind of pass through of information from login from the web application layer down to your data layer. So there's sort of one single source of truth for who this user is, and also makes it very clear what their data should be up front, what data should be returned for them up front. And finally, as I kind of talked about before around this idea of centralizing administration, we talked about bringing in an identity provider to have centralized governance of organizational access. But you also want to allow new teams to self-serve and be able to build for themselves without relying on you above above the layer of your stack. So of course, you want to automate your setup where you can. You often want to look at solutions that are API driven, and script driven as well, if you're kind of talking about the infrastructure layer here. But if you're able to do this when you're sort of setting up the organization, this is fantastic, right? This is a huge win. Now, a lot of off-the-shelf software doesn't have this, so it's a huge plus if a tool has the ability for you to script complete setup. And of course, this idea of building a center of excellence. So you want to engage external stakeholders, folks who will be using your applications, and understand what those business needs are. If those are effectively codified and communicated, and new teams who are building can easily get access to feedback, that's amazing, right? That means that you as the person kind of centralizing the governance can offload that development process onto new teams. And when you see new patterns emerge, right? So if you see folks reusing a lot of resources, reusing queries or reusing API calls, it might make sense to sort of centralize that and understand what do those patterns look like. Similarly, if folks are onboarding and asking the same questions, of course, templatizing this and bringing this back into your center of excellence is just as important. So we'll talk about a little bit more on training and enablement in just a second, but just to recap here around building that roadmap. Again, it starts off with understanding the users and understanding that governance model. So once you've defined how users get access to projects, how they get access to data, and their level of data level permissions, then you can then talk about sort of this process of onboarding those users and having them self-serve on the tools. So this, all these bullet points that you see here require a lot of different stakeholders. And that's extremely important when you're kind of thinking about modernization is, yes, you will have technical teams. They're often driven by technical teams, but they have to have the business users in mind. So when you have these processes, you have to break down sort of what's most important for the business, because that'll contextualize what you're assessing. That helps you decide what parts of your stack actually have a business fit at the time and which ones don't. When you have codified assessments, as I talked about kind of earlier on in the presentation, this lets you more accurately predict your costs and your level of resourcing whenever things change in your business. So if you have this kind of forecast, if you're also able to have this forecasting and having this assessment in place early on, again, you can look at this holistically and you can say almost as if you're kind of creating a financial forecast for your software, you can understand which layers will need replacing and how long, especially as the business objectives change. So when you're doing this assessment, you can also uncover blind spots, right? We talked about evaluating your software stack and looking at a tool, but depending on the business needs, you might actually not have a tool for the job. So that can create blind spots, right? But that could also help you assess those blind spots and say, okay, do we build something in-house for something like this? Or do we, again, buy a bespoke off-the-shelf software? And obviously then how does that scale across the company? So again, kind of going back from the business goals, taking a look at your software stack and taking a look at the level of fitness will kind of get you the answers that help you drive that modernization strategy. And so at this point, you've kind of figured out who your users are, you've understood your tooling stack and the resourcing requirements. And so now it's about communication and execution between both your technical teams and your business stakeholders. So modernization is ultimately driven by a technical part of the organization. Of course, there's process modernization, but again, we're looking at operation software. We're looking at tools that are built on data. And it's really important that you do have technical buy-in when you're looking at kind of upgrading parts of your stack and changing how things work. So the sequencing of that ultimately will depend on both the immediate business needs and the technical dependencies, right? The level of effort of maybe migrating from Snowflake or to and from Snowflake might be quite huge. And you might have to look at, well, what are faster wins that could deliver on those business objectives? It's often difficult to not have to upgrade, an application layer once you've upgraded your infrastructure layer. And so it does come sort of bottoms up. But that said, if you have a very consistent, very maintainable infrastructure layer, then perhaps, you might only look higher up in the stack. And again, this is all kind of understanding what those technical dependencies are. What we've seen as well as folks kind of modernize their stack, this often could be quite a long process. And so breaking this down into milestones, maintaining kind of that momentum, and figuring out what are those deliverables. So for internal teams, this could be providing bespoke applications that they might have not had before as part of a broader tooling strategy. For other teams, it could be saying that, well, our goal is consolidation. And so we actually want to see which vendors we don't need in a year if we can kind of prove out the use cases with this one tool. So that's where, again, having that kind of technical assessment and using kind of the word completeness for the business assessment will help you understand where that overlap is between tools. Help you understand sort of in that next year, what can I consolidate? And of course, as you're kind of building, you're constantly engaging different teams. Again, we're talking about integrations with data, integrations with third-party APIs, public-facing use cases. And so there will always be bottlenecks along the way. There will always be maybe dependencies on teams. For example, as we talked about, kind of having that shared services team. If you do have the need to be maintaining that central API, you need to have that kind of clear relationship and understanding that, hey, we're going to bring on new use cases. I have to provision additional groups for these users in Okta, and we're going to need to map those groups into every piece of software so that we can make sure that our software stack is secure and consistent from a security level on every single side. Great. So we breezed through that. I wanted to make sure that we leave 10 to 15 minutes just for Q&A here. So I will zoom out and take some questions. So let me see if I can check out the event questions. Okay, fantastic. So thank you for asking about the Slack message. Maybe some background. My computer was not able to load this, so I'm actually using a coworker's computer to run this presentation. So apologies for the late joining. Okay, Will Banks asked a question about building tools that have enterprise level integrations. So this is a really good question. Often, if you're either building this homegrown internally, you might not have integrations to all different data sources. It might also be very costly to build out those integrations. So of course you want to understand what's most important, what's top of mind, and what matters most to the business. I think that's kind of a cop-out answer here. But what we've seen with our customers is, if there aren't those enterprise level integrations, is that something that matters in the future as we look at replacing our tools holistically? Probably. Is that something that's required today for my core use case? If not, then of course, I think it is okay. And at that point, if you're thinking about a vendor, you want to make sure that their roadmap aligns with yours, so that over time it makes sense for you to kind of invest with them earlier on. So obviously, adding integrations is not straightforward. It can be straightforward depending on sort of who you're integrating with, but over the course of time, that might be super painful to maintain. So you just have to kind of really evaluate, does it make sense today? And if it does make sense in the future, will the cost of that kind of be painful or not? Cool. I'm also happy to share more customer examples if folks have any questions as well. Okay, great. Talking about getting buy-in from skeptical stakeholders after you build tooling. Great. Maybe Jackie, if I could ask a follow-up on what they would be skeptical about, but in general, of course, there's people that are resistant to change. I think the easiest way to get buy-in is to, again, map the business objectives of the tool. I like the old way better. Yeah. Often the kind of the status quo problem. So Retool is a vendor. It helps you build applications. It often replaces existing tools. It often replaces React. And status quo is kind of the main reason why you wouldn't want to bring an additional piece of software in, right? You're like, I think that the effort of introducing change is not worth maybe the business outcomes that it would drive. So again, it's really important to kind of quantify what that looks like. If folks, if you yourself don't like the old way, you have to be sure that that's not maybe a dogmatic motivation, right? So if you want to actually quantify that, you might look at, well, what does it cost to maintain this existing system, make changes? Are the upgrades that I'm making to that system, or the additional features that I'm adding actually going to be beneficial to the business? And if not, then okay, let's not do it. So yeah, I think kind of just quantifying as much as you can of the current state is important, but also saying, maybe the old will not make sense for the business in a year, and it's time to have this discussion now. Of course, this is, again, a series of trade-offs that you'd be making, right? No matter what, there will be time investment. So you want to look at, area under the curve. Am I spending a bunch of time investing in this now, only to pay, lower dividends in the future in terms of time investment? So this, again, if I'm, for example, going to be launching a product in 6 months, should I actually launch the support tooling alongside of it to make sure that our teams are able to handle an influx of requests and able to resolve that quickly? Because again, in the first 6 months of this product, customer support is really important. The answer to that is probably yes. But again, it's all about kind of building that framework and being objective. Otherwise, that kind of idea of building alignment is going to be very difficult over time. Cool. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for bearing with me on technical difficulties, and look forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks.